quality public television is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC TV.
Funding for this program is provided in part by the North Carolina Broadcast Legends Production Fund, including contributions from the following. For a complete list of project funders, go to unctv.org/nclegends.
Welcome to North Carolina Broadcast Legends, featuring industry leaders sharing stories from the rich and significant history of the broadcasting business here in our state. I'm your host, Mike Weeks. In 1957, 15-year-old Don Curtis walked into the studios of WKMT Radio in Kings Mountain, North Carolina, and applied for a job as a weekend announcer. The audition tape is still in his possession, and according to Don,
it was terrible.
While he didn't get the part-time announcing job, the owner of the station told Curtis he'd sell him an hour of time each week, which he could then resell to merchants in his hometown of Bessemer City, which didn't have a radio station. Don discovered then he could sell the time for more than he paid each week. And that was the beginning of an incredible broadcast career. Today, he owns Curtis Media Group, the largest network of radio stations in North Carolina, reaching over 3 million listeners daily. Don Curtis is a past president of the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters, a recipient of NCAB's Distinguished Service Award, and a member of the North Carolina Broadcasting Hall of Fame and the North Carolina Journalism Hall of Fame. And in 2015, Don was recognized by the Broadcasters Foundation of America with the Ward L. Quall Leadership Award presented at the National Association of Broadcasters Convention. And that Leadership Award recognizes radio and television broadcast excellence in America. Don Curtis is still on the air, hosting his own programs on radio station WPTF in Raleigh, including a 60-minute weekly public affairs program and a 4-hour weekly oldies program, the PTF Saturday Night Hall of Fame. After 60 years in broadcasting, Don Curtis still loves the business and looks forward to the next 60 years with great delight. Don Curtis, welcome to the program.
Well, delighted to be here. It's been a wonderful 60 years.
Well, we want to tell people some of the stories on how you got started. And your interest really started when you were in about 7th grade and you wanted a tape recorder for Christmas. Tell us about that.
Well, I don't know where that interest came from, but I did want a tape recorder, and as soon as I got it, I began getting interested in doing productions on the tape, and that's how it started.
So you would record yourself and play it back, and then, as you heard in the intro, you applied for an announcing job, but you didn't get it.
Not the weekend job. I got the 1-hour job.
Okay. But you then learned buying and selling time was a very lucrative thing for a teenager.
Well, actually, it was a great break from a business point of view because I was the manager. I had an hour. I had to produce it. I learned early on that I couldn't play the music I wanted to play. I had to play the music that the listeners wanted. I learned that how to sell. And I also learned that some people sometimes didn't pay their bills. And so I learned a lot of valuable lessons because, in a sense, I was in management early.
Absolutely. You did the show, you sold the commercials, and you had to collect for the advertising you sold. So
yes. And then I went from 1 hour a week to 2 hours a week to 1 hour a day.
Wow. Wow. Let's talk a little bit about going to school at Chapel Hill. Did you major in journalism?
I started out, my dad was a pharmacist, and while radio was of interest to me, I thought it was more of a hobby. And so I went to Chapel Hill to study pharmacy till I took my first botany course and went to the first lab, and I said, no, this is not for me. Mm-hmm. This is not for me. No, I did end up in journalism, in the broadcast curriculum of journalism. Actually, radio, television, and motion pictures was a separate department at that time.
Okay, so now from college, how did you get into owning or being involved in a first media property of some type?
Well, as I said, because I had that early break of being in management, and I'd done that all the way through college. It bought time wholesale and sold it retail. So I was pretty advanced as far as knowledge about broadcasting for a 24-year-old. I went home to Bessemer City, and nearby Cherryville, about 8 or 10 miles away, a man had gotten a license, and he had run afoul of the law and had lost his license. And so I got arranged with a group of businessmen in Cherryville to build the first radio station in Cherryville, North Carolina, WCSL.
Wow. Now, something happened very interesting. You had to go to Washington, D.C. To talk to the commission about you getting the license. The license had been granted, but the gentleman had lost it, so you were trying to acquire the license. But something very interesting happened on one of those trips.
Well, I was waiting to see my lawyer, and there was an office next door to my lawyer, the National Cable Television Association. And so I decided to walk in and find out what it was all about. And I'd never heard of cable television at that time. And so I got interested in it. And North Carolina at that time had 3 CATV systems, cable television systems, one in Wilmington, Waynesville, and Roanoke Rapids. And so I became interested in it and came back, and the same group of older businessmen backed me in going into the cable television business, which was entirely different than it is today. I mean, it was basically an antenna service then. Charged $5.95 a month. Wasn't everyone like that? And in many cases, like in Gastonia, it allowed you to have the third network because Charlotte and Raleigh were the 2 markets, well, I guess the larger markets in North Carolina that only had 2 VHF stations. Mm-hmm. So we built that, and then began to apply for franchises all across the state. And we ran out of money, and Jefferson Standard Broadcasting, and Carolina Telephone wanted in the business, so they bought us out, and I ended up working for them as a part of the deal for a year.
Wow. So you actually got in the cable TV business first, while you were in the process of getting your first license with the radio station in Cherryville.
Yeah. We were building 12-channel systems. All we had was 12 channels. 12 channels.
But when you sold that to Carolina Telephone, that also gave you some funding to be able to really pursue what you really were interested in, and that was radio.
Radio, yeah.
So let's talk about what happened from that point forward.
Well, we began to look around and find radio stations. Radio at that time was really based on communities, and we found a AM/FM station in Laurinburg, North Carolina, that had a FM permit. And again, FM at that time was rather insignificant, but from the time I guess I got into broadcasting, everybody said sooner or later FM is going to take over. And so I was interested. We bought the station, and I never will forget going back to the engineer and saying, do we have one of those Class C's or Class A's? And he said, we've got a Class C. And I said, well, I hate that. I would like to have one of the more powerful ones. Well, it turned out Class C was the more powerful one. And we built a 100,000 watt FM station in Laurinburg, which served Fayetteville, and that was the beginning of the real opportunity for Curtis Media Group. You
had some other experiences, and I want to go back to a great story that you've told about working at a station in North Wilkesboro. And you did a buy and sell program, I believe on Saturday mornings.
Yes. Yeah.
What was it called?
I can't remember. Maybe Swap Shop or something.
Swap Shop. It was called Swap Shop. You had an interesting call one morning from a lady that wanted to sell something. Tell people watching about that.
Well, she called, and I was from Gastonia, Bessemer City area, and she had a stillworm for sale. I had no idea in the world what a stillworm was, and so I said, well, describe it. And she said, well, it's a stillworm. I said, what's it made out of? And she said, copper. Well, I looked outside the window. The staff, of course, North Wilkesboro had a fair amount of bootlegging going on up there, and so they were out in the hall just rolling in laughter. They were going to let me hang, and they did. And I later found out, of course, from a local doctor that a stillworm was a part of a still.
Yeah, a moonshine still, and probably everybody had one in their backyard, and you didn't know that, but I'm sure it sold.
That station was operated by Doris Potter, who was the first female owner of a radio station in North Carolina, and later president of the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters.
My gosh.
Doris Brown.
Wow. Don, through your radio acquisitions, you also work for some other companies. You work for Durham Life's broadcast stations. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, in I guess 1982, my company was acquired by Durham Life Broadcasting, and as a part of it, I moved to Raleigh to operate Durham Life Broadcasting, and stayed about 2 years, and realized that I wanted to be back in ownership, and left the company. And of course, 6 years later, Durham Life decided to exit the broadcasting business, and we bought the stations back that I had sold, plus WPTF and WQDR.
And you still have those today.
Yes.
Let's talk also a little bit about entrepreneurs put stations on the air, and you certainly have an entrepreneurial spirit. You have also been a trailblazer for some radio formats. You started the first urban format station in Durham, and that was very successful.
Well, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, when AM was the predominant medium of the two, AM and FM, most stations were more general in their formats. It was beginning with FM, where stations began to focus on one particular genre of music, and so we were sort of early on in that, and we started the first country music station in Raleigh-Durham. We started the first urban station in Raleigh-Durham. Prior to that, most of the stations were more general in nature, would carry a broader form of music. You had top 40 stations and general interest stations and so forth.
And in that same light, you also had a great success in formatting a Spanish language station in Goldsboro. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, with the growth of the Hispanic community, an individual came in the office and said, you ought to look at Hispanic broadcasting. And quite frankly, the population of Hispanics had grown faster than I thought, and I looked at it and said, gee, this is an opportunity. So we took one of our 100,000 watt full service stations and converted it into Hispanic, Lele, which is still on the air. We later moved it to a more central part of the state to serve both Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and High Point, and Raleigh-Durham. But it's the most powerful Hispanic station between Washington and Atlanta.
And I remember, Don, something that you shared with me the first day that station went on the air. As far as advertising, it had such a great appeal to so many people. You had sold out all the ads when you began the station.
Exactly.
Wow.
The business community recognized the power of the Hispanic audience and really had nowhere to reach them. So it was a really good business opportunity. Still is.
And it's a very loyal audience.
Oh, yes.
You have another story you did about offering some type of free food or breakfast or something.
Well, we had a client, Smithfield Chicken and Barbecue. I guess I could mention that.
You can.
I have. It doesn't make any difference. And they bought a remote broadcast. And it was supposed to be a 3 or 4 hour broadcast. After about the first hour, the manager called me frantically, said, take it off. I'll pay you. Take it off. I said, what's that? He said, we're sold out. We don't have any food left.
Well, that's a great testament to the power of radio, and particularly locally owned and formatted radio stations. Don, we always hear when something new comes along, whether it's Pandora or satellite radio or all these, television was going to put radio out of business, streaming was going to put radio out of business. Let's talk about some of the technological changes in the radio business and all these so-called threats and that really haven't turned out to be true. Used to be we dealt with live announcers and tapes. That's not how things work today.
Well, in many stations it still is, although you do have a number of stations that have become more music-oriented and really don't need announcers as such. The top stations usually have live and local morning shows, and then some of the more specific music formats are basically live assist, we call it, where announcers pre-record the program. But one of the things that's interesting about radio broadcasting is it's still the only medium that's wireless. And so it's being portable. And also radio broadcasting has remained local in nature. And all the so-called threats have actually augmented the audio area and caused more people to listen to audio, but really never affected radio. Radio's audience today is still higher percentage-wise as far as reach than even television on a weekly basis, and the audience keeps growing and hasn't changed. And we've been buried about 10 times. Beginning in the 50s when television came along, they said, well, that's the end of radio. But it's distinctly different. Television is entirely different from radio. And I bet the only thing we share is microphones and the FCC. Those are about the only two things we share.
I'll tell you, yes, and those are two very important things. Let's talk a little bit about the Curtis Media Group. You're the largest owner of radio stations in North Carolina. How many do you have now?
We have about 50 stations, including a number of what we call translators, which are FM stations that rebroadcast an AM signal. We also have the North Carolina News Network that serves about 80 other stations, most of which are not ours, with an hourly newscast and some other features. Okay. We have the Southern Farm Network, which specializes in farm news broadcasting, particularly in the eastern North and South Carolina and Virginia.
Great. Well, that's a lot, and you have kind of a unique formula. You know, we see these large conglomerates and different groups that are owned by corporations and shareholders. You are a single shareholder at the Curtis Media Group.
Well, you know, I explain to people that the Curtis Media Group is not a democracy. It's a dictatorship.
Well, you're the boss, but you have a very unique formula in the fact that you have a lot of small stations maybe that the big groups wouldn't be interested in if they were not top 50 markets or those types of things. How do you coordinate all that? How do you make that all work?
Well, from a business point of view, it really is not a good model because we do have stations. We have very large stations, and we have a number of middle market stations, and then we have some small stations, and that's really not a good business model. But I'm still a romantic, and I love the little stations about as much as I love the big ones. And broadcasting it to the listener is the same. They may be listening to the most insignificant radio station in the world, but to them, it's their radio station. So you have to remember that while the audiences may vary from, as WQDR, our largest station, reaches about 450,000 people a week, down to some stations that maybe reach 5,000 a week. But to those listeners, it's just as important. And so you have to remember that it is a personal bonding between the listener. Of course, the average person does listen to about around 5 or 6 different radio stations in a week.
Well, that seems like a lot, but you're exactly right. As I think about the stations that I listen to, that's absolutely correct. Let's talk a little bit about your involvement with the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters. And let's talk about maybe some of the people and some of the stories from events. You've told me an interesting story about a fellow from Asheville that was a radio broadcaster and people didn't see much of.
Zeb Lee, I never met him, but he was famous for the fact that I think for something like 40 years, some large number of years, he was in his radio station every day, never missed a day for like 40 years.
Wow.
Maybe an hour, maybe a half an hour, but he was there every day for 40 years, Saturdays, Sundays, Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, right down the line.
Well, he couldn't make it to any of the meetings or events because he was busy running his business.
His radio station was WSKY, which stood for Sky, but a lot of people call it Whiskey because
yeah.
It also stood for that.
Yeah, well, they're in the mountains there, they have a reputation for that, particularly at that time. What are some other interesting stories that you recall in your history of broadcasting in North Carolina?
Oh, there's so many. All of a sudden, my mind is totally blank. You might remember one from our first interview, but my mind is blank right now. There's so many.
Well, you've done so many things and you have so many stations. Let's go back to the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters. That's been an organization that's been so important where different people met and shared business examples and stories. You've been involved in that group for over 30 years?
Oh, yes, yeah, and, probably 40.
Yeah.
You know, broadcasting has gone through a long period of growth, and of course, the FCC, which is the body that looks after us, of course, started out first with radio and then added television, and now almost all forms of communications are under their supervision. But broadcasting back in the 50s was really tightly regulated until I think the FCC very wisely began to realize that the marketplace will take care of all those sorts of things. In other words, at one time we had a commercial limit. We could not exceed that. Well, the FCC finally found out that the listener will only take so many commercials before they tune out to another radio station. And so at one point we had a commercial limit of 18 minutes. Now most stations average about 12 minutes of time, but that's unregulated now. And so a lot of the regulations became unnecessary, and equipment became far more stable. Many times we had a lot of technical standards that we had to run a test on to prove that we were within tolerance. And again, the FCC said, well, now wait a minute, people aren't going to listen to radio stations that don't sound good, so we don't need those regulations, and they didn't. So there have been a lot of changes, and the associations led the way in a lot of that.
Well, and Don, you're a daily hands-on operator. I know I've called for you, and you've been conducting sales training. And this kind of goes back to your first meeting with the owner of WKMT, Jonas Bridges, when you didn't get the initial announcing job, but you became an announcer and then found out you were great at the business element, and you still teach those principles to your employees today.
Well, you know, we have three constituencies in a broadcasting company. We have the listeners, we have the advertisers, and we have our staff. And to bring them together is your goal. You're trying to say, okay, we've got a bonding experience here between the advertiser, the listener, and the staff member. And we have to bring them together and get them on the same page, because each of those three tend to think that they're the most important one. And actually, it's pretty much a balance of all three.
I think you're exactly right. Don, not only are you a pioneer in the radio business, we were talking earlier, you contribute to and support many different broadcast entities, and one of them has been UNC-TV. You've been a member of their trustees, and in fact, you've even lobbied the legislature for greater support of public television in North Carolina. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, there's so many different ways, and public radio is also a very important part of the
Yes.
whole spectrum. All of these entities fill a need for communication with the public. Public television has a unique role in North Carolina because it's a statewide system. Public radio does a great job, especially in some formats that are not large enough to be viable. Some are. But both of those entities, public radio and public television, I think are very important to the overall broadcast industry. And so we like to be supportive of them. We don't consider them competitive to what we do, because commercial broadcasters do an entirely different thing.
And not only have you been supportive at the industry levels, you also personally have taken your time, not only lobbied at the legislature, but put together funding when legislators thought they'd funded public television, and they hadn't.
Well, at one time I appeared before a committee, and this was maybe like 1980 or so, and they said, well, we funded public television back in 1950. I said, you know, cameras are like air conditioners. They wear out, and transmitters wear out. And so the General Assembly became far more receptive. And of course, they realized from being back home with the public of how much the public values public television and public radio for that matter.
And in fact, we're in the Goodman studio recording this interview, and protege and a good friend of yours, Jim Goodman. Also, you guys have worked together to support many of the things that happened here. And,
we live about a block apart. And Jim's a little younger than I am, but Jim's one of the people I put on a pedestal because he's done so many good things for broadcasting and for North Carolina.
Now, in the intro, I talk about the fact that you've been in the broadcasting business for 60 years, and you very joyfully and positively are looking forward to many more years. Tell us, what's next for Don Curtis?
Well, you know, I've never really had a plan except that we would continue to grow. I think a business has to always look forward, or else the business dies. And so I try to separate myself as an individual and as a person from being a stockholder. And as a stockholder, the company has to move forward. So I don't know what's next, whatever opportunities come along. By the way, I need to mention that that first little radio station that I worked at, Jim Hevner, who you will later interview, worked at the same station, and I replaced him later on as the weekend announcer.
Wow. Well, and as we look at people that have been instrumental and pioneers in North Carolina broadcasting, a lot of you attended the same classes at the same time at UNC Chapel Hill and worked at some of the same stations, and thank goodness for people like Jonas Bridges that own that station. As we've mentioned, we did a long form interview, and if you would like more information or to learn more about Don Curtis and his pioneering in the broadcasting business, you can watch our long form interview on the web at ncbroadcastlegends.com. Again, that's ncbroadcastlegends.com. We want to thank you, Don, for being with us today. This has been a wonderful rendition and some great stories, and we hope people have gotten more interested and can recognize more of all the contributions you've made. And we hope that you'll join us next time on another edition of North Carolina Broadcast Legends.
Funding for this program is provided in part by the North Carolina Broadcast Legends Production Fund, including contributions from the following: For a complete list of project funders, go to unctv.org/nclegends.
Quality public television is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC TV.